And I am recording. Host Hans Johansson, you are welcome to Heidegger 1634a. Life Death by Jacques Derrida. And we are currently on the third session, page 54. Five, four. And we have been talking earlier on about speaking, hearing, and you speak, and many ones are listening. And we also mentioned that a singular person listening to Nietzsche, and after that told the world what Nietzsche was saying. These are all different aspects of talking, receiving, listening in, understanding, I would say too. We need to see that there is a doing in listening. It can be active. So I will continue exactly where I left off in 1628. The final paragraph is even more enigmatic. There is still someone who dies outside the one who says, I, Oedipus, who also dies to make the transition. We do not know if this additional someone who dies is another, or if it is the same. If it is the voice of the same that hears itself, speaking to itself, that has an ear for dying, it is perhaps quite simply the voice that dies. The voice of Oedipus, who dies, that dies, Oedipus who dies as voice, or who dies to his voice, renouncing his voice. Let me first retranslate this final paragraph. And yet, I still hear you, beloved voice, someone outside of me, the last man is dying in this universe, an impersonal construction, yet another one more outside of me. The last sigh, your sigh, dies with me. The drawn out woo, sighing around me. Oedipus, the last of the woeful men. End of quote. And maybe we can have the text a bit further up. Literally, woo, veha, sighing upon me. The last of the veha mention, the last woman, the last woeful man. The last to say woo, the last to lament. Oedipus. But the structure of what Blanchot would call the narrative voice is such that we do not know if the one who dies outside of me is someone else whose voice or whose sighs we hear. It's just gallantry here. Or if it is the voice itself, that of the one who alone dies and speaks to himself. It is as much to the other as to the voice as other that he says the last sigh, your sigh dies with me. Reread this fragment and you will see that one cannot and thus does not have to distinguish between this other who dies always with me, in addition to me, in addition to me as an other endowed with a voice and my voice endowed. I would say with the other. It is a question of the voice as other, which always dies with Oedipus thereby constituting him in his terrible soliloquizing solitude, or else of the other as my voice. And what dies with the last is the other as voice, or as my voice. It is the last word of the autobiography as autothanatography, which would then no longer designate just the writing of my own death, but also the writing of the death of myself, of the Aftos, as Oedipus man, philosopher, as the voice of the hearing oneself speak at the very moment when he says to it, as to the other beloved voice, you are beautiful, and so on. I will just comment here, this is self-reflection before expression. Kleinbottle, as you remember, everything subjective is the starting point of the objective, or the indigenous always is before the exogenous. You speak to yourself. If it were not a little ridiculous to dole out praise in this way, I would say to you that in this case, the best reading, or rather as is appropriate, the best rewriting of the fragment I just read is Blanchot's narrative titled The Last Man. Let me pull out just a few lines near the beginning, though you should read everything, of course, since this selection is a bit crude. He wasn't addressing anyone. I don't mean he wasn't speaking to me, but someone other than me was listening to him. The happiness of saying yes, of endlessly affirming. He needed to be one too many, one more, only one more. The thought which is spared me at each moment, that he, the last man is nevertheless not the last, but slowly, abruptly, the thought occurred to me that this story had no witness. I was there. The I was already no more than a who, a whole crowd of who's, so that there would be no one between him and his destiny, so that his face would remain bare and his gaze undivided. I was there not in order to see him, but so he wouldn't see himself, so that it would be me he saw in the mirror, someone other than him, another, a stranger, nearby, gone, the shadow of the other shore, no one. And that in this way he would remain a man until the very end. He was not to split in two. This is the great temptation of those who are approaching their end. They look at themselves and they talk to themselves. They turn to themselves in a solitude, people, by themselves. The emptiest, the most false. But if I was present, he would be the most alone of men, without even himself, without that last man which he was, and thus he would be the very last. The one who seems to be speaking here, the narrative voice, ensures by his presence the keeping of the last man who must be alone, even this last one who he was. And it is in keeping him without him, without the last who he was. It is in this way that he assures that he is the very last. For if the last were with himself, he wouldn't be alone. And thus would not be the last. To keep himself as last, he must lose himself as last. And to lose himself as last, he must still keep himself as last. This might be said of this last step, not beyond, pas au-delà, the last. This necessarily has to do with the structure of forgetting that no longer has any relation to what psychology, philosophy, and even a certain psychoanalysis teach us with this word, which we must relearn to read, for example, in Nietzsche or Blanchot. The last man must forget in order to be the last man. He must no longer even see himself having himself or have any knowledge as to who he is, no longer even keep himself as last, no longer have any relation to himself, no relation of keeping. Even in the form of forgetting that is kept. For example, in the form of something repressed. Very important. This implies between the last and his beyond a step, not pas, of transition, whose structure is unique, unheard of, neither dialectical nor anti-dialectical, which neither keeps nor suppresses what it keeps and suppresses, and so on. The necessity of this rethinking of forgetting is often mentioned in Le Livre de Philosophie, Le Livre de Philosophe, as well as in Blanchot's The Last Man. And I will look at some gems just quickly. There will be a longer summary in the B edition of this 1634. It's on page 55. We have a gem towards the end of 55. And we have the keeping Lagarde of the last man who must be alone without even this last one, who he was. It is in this way that he assures that he is the very last. And even more important, for if the last were with himself, still able to hear himself, he would not be alone, and thus would not be the last. This sharpens the idea of reflexive talking. You speak to yourself when you talk. Although it's constantly directed to others, it is first and foremost the ego subject speaking to oneself. And as long as you have yourself, you are never alone. You are not the last. And on page 56, there's a rather elongated spin on words as usual. The last man, in the very beginning, must forget in order to be the last man. He must forget. He must no longer even see himself, savoir, to have himself, savoir, or have any knowledge as to who he is, savoir comme ce qu'il est, no longer even keep himself, se garder, as last, no longer have any relation to himself, no relation of keeping, even in the form of a forgetting that is kept, for example, in the form of something repressed. Absolutely, gallantry. A very short comment from Kalle before we end this session. On the surface, it's a spin on words of the different meanings of garder, avoir, but it once more, to be very short, is the verse and recto once more. The double takes are active in this. And in order to do that, you must forget yourself. The forgetfulness is forgetting that you start. The shortest thing I can say here, you can see yourself from the outside as a third person. I could see myself as Hans Johansson, somebody else looking at me. But here we go to ourselves and we, so to speak, need to forget what we are on the outside to become the true subjective, where it all starts from. And I would say this most suppressed subjective in the Western world. It's a reversal of that suppression. That's my comment. But we will elaborate that further next time. I'm afraid now it's the bell went. I say thank you very much for today, and we will return with a longer summary and some more reading in 1634b. Have a very good day. Bye bye for now.